What if the world's most infamous unidentified killer has already been named, and we simply refuse to accept it? For more than a century, the shadow of Jack the Ripper has hovered over history. 5 murdered women, a city gripped by fear, a killer who vanished into fog and legend. But in recent years, headlines declared something explosive. DNA has identified him. Case closed. Or is it? Before you decide, ask yourself, could a 130-year-old mystery really be solved by a single shawl? Comment yes or a no, because what we're about to uncover might change your answer. The setting is London, 1888, the district of Whitechapel. Gaslights, crowded streets, panic rising. Investigators at the time believed they were hunting a local monster, someone hiding in plain sight. Letters signed Jack the Ripper fueled terror, though many experts now suspect some were hoaxes. The twist? Despite intense investigation, no suspect was ever charged. The case went cold. Yet over a century later, modern science re-entered the scene. What if Victorian failure was only temporary? And what exactly did modern DNA supposedly prove? In 2014, businessman and Ripper enthusiast Russell Edwards announced something extraordinary. He claimed DNA evidence linked the murders to a Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski. Headlines exploded worldwide. Ripper identified. The hook was irresistible. But here's the twist. This conclusion rested heavily on a single piece of fabric, a shawl allegedly found near victim Catherine Eddowes. That fabric had passed through many hands over decades. So here's the question. How reliable can DNA really be after 100 years of handling and storage? Let's slow down. The shawl was said to have been collected by a police officer at the crime scene in 1888, but official records do not clearly document this item. That's the first complication. The second, it was never properly preserved as forensic evidence. Instead, it became a family heirloom. Decades later, it resurfaced at auction. Twist upon twist. So when DNA testing was performed in the 2000s, skeptics immediately raised alarms. Could contamination have altered everything before testing even began? Here's where it gets technical, but stay with me. The testing reportedly found mitochondrial DNA matching descendants of both Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. That sounds definitive, but mitochondrial DNA doesn't uniquely identify one individual. It traces maternal lines. Many people can share similar sequences. So while it might narrow possibilities, it cannot pinpoint a single person with absolute certainty. That's the bigger twist. If thousands could theoretically share similar mitochondrial markers, does this really solve anything? Supporters argue that Kosminski was already a prime suspect in 1888. He was mentioned in police memoranda. He was institutionalized. He lived in the area. The DNA, they claim, simply confirms long-standing suspicions. But critics counter that confirmation bias may be at play. When you start with a suspect and then interpret ambiguous evidence, are you uncovering truth or reinforcing assumptions? Pause and think about that before we go deeper. Could modern technology be amplifying an old theory rather than revealing new certainty? Another layer complicates the story. The DNA study was not initially published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That raised eyebrows in academic circles. Scientists asked to review the data reportedly noted inconsistencies in how sequences were interpreted. In fact, some geneticists argued the published sequence variations were misread. That's a major twist. If the scientific interpretation was flawed, then what exactly did the test show? And why did headlines move faster than scientific scrutiny? Let's zoom out. For decades, Aaron Kosminski had been one suspect among many. Others included Montague Druitt, George Chapman, and even royal conspiracy theories involving Prince Albert Victor. Each theory had circumstantial support. Each fell apart under scrutiny. The Ripper case has always attracted dramatic conclusions. So here's the new question. Is the DNA claim fundamentally different from past sensational theories, or simply a modern version dressed in laboratory credibility? Tell me in the comments, is this science or storytelling? One major criticism revolves around chain of custody. In modern criminal investigations, evidence is sealed, documented, preserved meticulously. In 1888, such standards barely existed. The shawl reportedly traveled through families, collectors, and auction houses. Each transfer introduced possible contamination. DNA from descendants, museum handlers, or previous owners could easily have transferred onto the fabric. That's not speculation, that's a known forensic risk. So how can we separate 19th century material from 20th century contamination? Then comes the issue of selective reporting. Supporters emphasize that Kosminski's DNA matched a descendant of the victim. But critics note that mitochondrial DNA profiles are not rare. Some argue the match could represent a large population group rather than a specific individual. That's the bigger twist. If a genetic marker is common within Eastern European Jewish populations, does matching it truly isolate Kosminski? Or does it simply confirm he belonged to a broader demographic category? What investigators believed at first in 1888 was that the killer likely had anatomical knowledge. The precision of the attacks led some to suspect a doctor. Kosminski, however, was a barber. That contradiction still lingers. While barbers of that era handled razors daily, does that equate to surgical skill? Historians debate this fiercely. If the psychological profile suggested medical expertise, does Kosminski truly fit? Or were early assumptions about anatomy exaggerated by Victorian panic? Another twist emerges from police documentation. A memo by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson named Kosminski as a suspect who was identified by a witness but never testified against. Yet this identification remains disputed. No formal charge followed. No trial. No recorded confession. So even before DNA, the case against him was circumstantial. If Victorian police couldn't secure enough evidence, does modern mitochondrial testing bridge that gap, or simply add another layer of ambiguity? Let's consider motive and mental state. Kosminski was institutionalized for mental illness. Some argue this fits the psychological portrait of a violent offender. Others caution against retroactively diagnosing or stigmatizing mental illness. The twist? There's no documented history linking him directly to violence toward women. That absence doesn't prove innocence, but it complicates certainty. So ask yourself, are we interpreting sparse records to fit a dramatic narrative? Scientific critics also noted that early reports about the DNA included claims of a 100% match. In genetics, that phrase is misleading. Mitochondrial DNA does not provide that level of individual specificity. Some experts argued the language overstated what the data could support. When media simplifies complex science, conclusions can appear stronger than they are. So here's the pressing question. Did public excitement outrun scientific caution? Another overlooked detail involves how mitochondrial DNA can only trace maternal lineage. Over generations, that lineage expands exponentially. Thousands of individuals may share similar sequences. So when we hear DNA match, we instinctively think uniqueness. But here, uniqueness isn't guaranteed. That distinction is critical. Without nuclear DNA, the gold standard for individual identification, certainty remains elusive. So why wasn't nuclear DNA obtained? Was it degraded beyond recovery? Experts argue that extracting usable nuclear DNA from a 19th century fabric exposed to environmental damage would be extraordinarily difficult. Degradation, humidity, handling, all factors erode clarity. So perhaps mitochondrial DNA was the only viable option. That makes sense scientifically, but it also limits conclusions. The bigger twist? The very age that makes the evidence exciting also makes it fragile. Can fragile science carry the weight of historical certainty? Let's revisit media coverage. When the story broke, headlines were decisive. Ripper identified. Few outlets emphasized the methodological debates. Public perception solidified quickly. Once people believe a mystery is solved, it becomes psychologically harder to reopen it. That's a powerful dynamic. So here's the new question. Are we witnessing a social desire for closure more than a forensic breakthrough? Historians who specialize in Victorian crime caution against rewriting narratives based on a single artifact. They note the lack of independent replication. In science, replication strengthens validity. So far, no broad scientific consensus has declared the case definitively solved. That absence matters. If multiple laboratories reanalyzed the shawl and reached identical conclusions, confidence would increase. Until then, uncertainty lingers. Would you trust a result that hasn't been widely replicated? Another twist lies in authorship. Russell Edwards, who promoted the DNA findings, also wrote a book presenting his conclusion. Critics suggest potential conflict of interest. That doesn't automatically invalidate evidence, but it introduces motive for sensational framing. When commercial incentives intersect with historical mysteries, skepticism rises. So ask yourself, does publicity risk shaping interpretation? But here's the counterpoint. Not all critics are unbiased either. Some historians resist closure because the mystery fuels academic and public fascination. An unsolved ripper sustains books, tours, documentaries. Closure could disrupt an entire cultural industry. That's the bigger twist. Bias may exist on multiple sides. So who stands to gain more from declaring the case solved or unsolved? We must also confront the passage of time. Evidence degrades. Witnesses disappear. Context fades. Solving cold cases centuries later requires balancing hope with realism. The DNA claim represents one of the few tangible scientific attempts to cut through legend. That effort deserves consideration, but does effort equal proof? Or is it simply the most persuasive theory so far? What still doesn't make sense is the lack of overwhelming forensic consensus. If the case were airtight, major scientific bodies would likely endorse it publicly. Instead, debate persists. Geneticists continue to question data interpretation. Historians continue to question provenance. That sustained disagreement keeps the door open. So is this an evolving discovery or a premature conclusion? Imagine if new testing technologies emerge in the next decade. More advanced sequencing, better contamination filtering. Could the shawl or other artifacts be re-examined? That possibility keeps the mystery alive. Science evolves. Conclusions shift. So perhaps today's uncertainty is temporary. But until that day comes, should we label Kosminski definitively as Jack the Ripper? Let's reflect on impact. Naming someone as a historical serial killer carries ethical weight. Descendants live today. Communities remember. Assigning guilt without courtroom standards raises moral questions. Even in death, reputations matter. That's a profound consequence. Are we comfortable declaring guilt based on debated mitochondrial data alone? At the same time, ignoring potential breakthroughs can stall historical justice. If the DNA truly narrows the field significantly, dismissing it entirely might be equally flawed. The balance is delicate. Accept cautiously, reject carefully. The twist is that both extremes, blind acceptance and total dismissal, could be wrong. So where does this leave us? We have a suspect historically noted by police. We have mitochondrial DNA linking material to descendants. We have contested interpretation. We have chain of custody questions. Layer upon layer. The evidence is intriguing, but not absolute. Does intriguing equal convincing? When investigators first walked Whitechapel streets, they relied on witness statements and gut instinct. Today, we rely on genetic code. Different centuries, different tools. Yet uncertainty persists. That continuity is almost haunting. Is the Ripper case destined to remain permanently ambiguous, no matter how advanced our technology becomes? Perhaps the real story isn't about whether Kosminski was the killer. Perhaps it's about how modern society grapples with unsolved trauma from the past. We crave resolution. We want villains named. But history resists tidy endings. So ask yourself, are we chasing closure or chasing truth? If future peer-reviewed studies validate the findings with broader consensus, the narrative could shift dramatically. If they refute them, the mystery deepens again. That fragile balance keeps researchers cautious. Science is iterative. Conclusions are provisional. In that sense, the case is neither solved nor untouched. It's suspended. What we know is limited but significant. Kosminski was a documented suspect. DNA analysis suggested a maternal link. What remains unclear is uniqueness, contamination levels, and statistical certainty. Those gaps matter. They prevent absolute claims. And in true crime, the line between possibility and proof is everything. As we move toward reflection, consider how narratives shape memory. If enough people accept a conclusion, it becomes cultural truth, even if scientific debate continues. The Ripper legend has evolved before, can evolve again. The question is whether evolution equals accuracy. More than 130 years later, 5 women's lives still anchor this discussion. The focus should never drift entirely to the killer's mystique. Whether Kosminski or someone else, the tragedy remains real. Solving the case matters because memory matters. Justice matters. But justice demands rigor. So, has Jack the Ripper finally been identified? The honest answer, for now, is uncertain. The DNA evidence is compelling to some, contested by others, and not universally accepted. It narrows the field. It does not eliminate doubt. And perhaps that lingering doubt is why the mystery survives. What do you believe, case closed or still unsolved? Comment below, share your perspective, and subscribe to Crime Rift for the next investigation. Because sometimes history whispers but never fully answers.